The scene was electric. Bright lights illuminated the stage, casting sharp shadows on the polished wooden floor. The audience filled the theater, their murmurs creating a low hum that buzzed with anticipation. At one podium stood a young woman, in her late 20s, wearing a crisp blazer and an expression of quiet determination. Across from her, lounging casually in his chair, was a man who had spent decades making headlines with his sharp tongue and bold opinions. This wasn't just any debate. It was a clash of generations, ideologies, and styles. On one side, Sir had someone fresh to the national spotlight but armed with research, conviction, and a knack for simplifying complex ideas. On the other, a seasoned veteran known for tearing down opponents with cutting humor and relentless skepticism. Everyone knew this would be good television, but no one could have predicted just how unforgettable it would become. As the host introduced both participants, the energy shifted. The older debater leaned back in his seat, his trademark smirk already in place. He exuded confidence, almost as if he'd already decided this was going to be another easy win. After all, he'd been in countless debates like this before. Young voices came and went, and most crumbled under the weight of his quick wit and intimidating presence. But tonight felt slightly different. There was something about the way the younger speaker carried herself, calm, composed, and ready, that made a few people in the audience sit up straighter. When it was time for opening statements, the seasoned debater took the lead. His tone dripped with sarcasm as he began questioning whether young commentators really understood the nuances of topics like free speech. "You know," he said, leaning forward with a grin, "it's not enough to show up with passion. You need depth too." The remark drew polite laughter from parts of the crowd, but instead of looking rattled, the young woman simply nodded. She let him finish, her eyes steady and focused. Then, without hesitation, she stepped up to the mic. Her voice rang out clear and strong, immediately grabbing everyone's attention. She didn't waste time with fluff or unnecessary pleasantries. Instead, she dove right into her argument, explaining why free speech couldn't exist without accountability. She spoke passionately about real-life examples, how misinformation spread online had led to families losing loved ones, businesses collapsing, and communities torn apart. Her words weren't abstract theories. They were grounded in stories anyone could relate to. At one point, she paused and looked directly at her opponent. "Let me ask you something," she said calmly. "If someone spreads false information that causes harm, should we just shrug it off because they claim it's their right to say it?" The question hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. For a moment, even the seasoned debater seemed caught off guard. He tried to brush it aside with a joke, but the audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were listening, really listening, to what she had to say. What struck people most was her authenticity. She didn't try to mimic the older debater's style or match his cynicism. Instead, she stayed true to herself, speaking plainly and sincerely. And while her opponent relied on clever quips and theatrical gestures, she countered with facts, logic, and heart. It was clear she wasn't there to entertain. She was there to make a point, and she was doing it exceptionally well. By the time she wrapped up her opening statement, the atmosphere in the room had changed. People exchanged glances, whispering to each other about how impressive she was. Even some of the older debaters' fans found themselves nodding along to her arguments. It was still early in the debate, but one thing was certain. This wasn't going to be the walk in the park her opponent had expected. Little did anyone know the best was yet to come. The seasoned debater wasn't about to let the young speaker steal the spotlight without a fight. As soon as she finished her opening statement, he leaned forward, his trademark smirk returning. "Okay, very passionate," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "But let's get real here. You're basically saying we should police what people say online. Isn't that just another form of censorship?" His tone was light, almost playful, but there was an edge to it, a challenge. For a moment, the audience seemed unsure of how to react. Some nodded along, clearly agreeing with him. Others shifted in their seats, curious to see how the young woman would respond. She didn't hesitate. Instead of getting defensive or raising her voice, she smiled slightly, as if she'd been expecting this exact argument. Then, in a calm and measured tone, she broke it down for everyone. "Let's be clear," she began, leaning into the mic. "I'm not talking about policing opinions. Everyone has the right to express themselves. What I'm talking about is holding people accountable when their words cause harm. Free speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences." Her delivery was steady, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. She went on to explain the difference between disagreeing with someone's opinion and calling out falsehoods that lead to real-world damage. To drive her point home, she shared a story, a personal one. She talked about a friend who had lost their job after falling victim to misleading financial advice spread through social media. The information had sounded legitimate at first glance, posted by someone claiming to be an expert. But when the truth came out, it was too late. Lives were disrupted, savings wiped out, all because no one questioned the source or held them accountable for spreading lies. Her opponent tried to interrupt halfway through, throwing out a sarcastic remark about playing the victim card. But she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she calmly held up a finger, signaling she wasn't done yet. When she finally paused, the room was silent. Even the seasoned debater sat back, momentarily at a loss for words. It wasn't just the story itself that resonated. It was the way she told it, with raw emotion and relatable details that made it impossible to tune out. Sensing she had the upper hand, she pressed further. "Think about it," she continued. "When someone drives recklessly and causes an accident, we don't shrug it off because they have the right to drive however they want. We hold them accountable for their actions. Why should spreading dangerous misinformation be any different?" The analogy struck a chord. Murmurs rippled through the audience as people nodded in agreement. Her opponent crossed his arms, his earlier confidence wavering. Determined to regain control, he switched tactics. He started peppering her with rapid-fire questions, trying to trip her up. "So you're saying every tweet, every post, every comment should be fact-checked? Who gets to decide what's true and what's not? Where do we draw the line?" Each question was sharper than the last, designed to corner her into contradicting herself. But instead of stumbling, she took a deep breath and tackled each one head-on. She explained that accountability didn't mean stifling free expression. It meant encouraging critical thinking. Platforms could implement better systems for flagging false information without silencing dissenting voices. Experts could weigh in when necessary, but the goal wasn't to create a ministry of truth. "It's about empowering people to think critically and make informed decisions," she said firmly. "That's not censorship, that's responsibility." By now, the audience was fully engaged. Gone were the polite chuckles and scattered applause. People were leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word. Some even pulled out their phones to capture key moments, sensing this debate was turning into something extraordinary. Meanwhile, the seasoned debater looked increasingly uneasy. His usual arsenal of jokes and jabs wasn't landing the way it usually did. For perhaps the first time in years, he found himself struggling to keep up. As the second segment drew to a close, the young speaker wrapped up her response with a powerful statement. "Free speech is a cornerstone of democracy, but so is truth. If we value one over the other, we risk undermining both." Her words hung in the air, echoing long after she stepped back from the mic. The audience erupted into applause, not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from genuine admiration. Even some of her opponent's supporters couldn't help but clap. For the seasoned debater, the writing was on the wall. This wasn't going to be an easy win. In fact, it was starting to look like anything but. And as the moderator signaled for a brief break before the next round, the tension in the room was palpable. No one wanted to miss a single moment of what promised to be an unforgettable showdown. When the debate resumed after the break, the seasoned debater was clearly determined to regain control. He leaned into the mic, his voice sharper than before. "All right," he said with a forced laugh, "let's talk about this idea of accountability. Who decides what's harmful and what's not? Aren't you just opening the door for people to silence anyone they disagree with?" His tone carried an accusatory edge, as if he'd finally cornered her. The audience stirred, sensing another heated exchange brewing. Some nodded along, agreeing with him, while others waited anxiously to hear how she would respond. If anything, the room felt even more charged now. The young speaker didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled faintly, as though she'd been expecting this line of attack all along. "Let me ask you something," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Do we let drivers speed through school zones because it's their right to go as fast as they want? No, because we know the consequences could be deadly. It's not about silencing them. It's about protecting others." She paused, letting the analogy sink in. The same principle applies here. Accountability isn't about shutting down opinions. It's about preventing harm. There's a big difference. Her opponent raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "But where do you draw the line?" he shot back. "Who gets to decide what's harmful? One person's truth is another person's conspiracy theory. Isn't that dangerous territory?" This time she didn't hesitate. "Of course, it's complicated," she admitted, nodding slightly. "But complexity doesn't mean we throw up our hands and do nothing. We already have systems in place for this: courts, fact-checkers, independent experts. The goal isn't perfection, it's progress. Ignoring the problem won't make it go away." Her response struck a nerve. The audience erupted into murmurs. Again, some clapping softly while others whispered to their neighbors. Her points were simple yet powerful, cutting through the noise with clarity. Even her opponent seemed momentarily thrown off balance. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, searching for his next move. Determined to regain the upper hand, he switched tactics once more. This time, he went personal. "Look," he said with a smirk, "I respect your passion, I really do. But you're talking about issues that have been around for decades. What makes you think you've got all the answers now?" It was a classic move, undermining her credibility by questioning her experience. A lesser debater might have faltered under such a direct jab. But instead of backing down, she leaned into it. With a small, self-aware smile, she replied, "You're right. I don't have all the answers. No one does. But fresh perspectives can offer new solutions. Experience is valuable, sure, but so is innovation. Sometimes it takes someone who hasn't been stuck in the same debates for years to see things differently." The crowd loved it. Laughter rippled through the theater, followed by applause. Even some of her opponent's supporters couldn't help but chuckle at the clever retort. For a moment, the seasoned debater looked genuinely surprised. He hadn't expected her to turn his own words against him so effectively. Not willing to give up, he doubled down. "Okay, fair enough," he said, his smirk returning. "But let's get practical. How do you propose we implement these accountability measures without creating chaos? Government stepping in? Big tech companies deciding what's true or false? That sounds like a recipe for disaster." She didn't miss a beat. "Governments shouldn't be the ones policing speech," she said firmly. "And yes, big tech has its issues, but there are smarter ways to approach this. Independent oversight boards, transparent algorithms, community reporting systems, all of these can help strike a balance. It's not perfect, but doing nothing is far worse." Her confidence was magnetic. Every word she spoke felt grounded in logic and empathy, making it hard for anyone to dismiss her outright. The seasoned debater tried to interject a few times, throwing out sarcastic remarks and exaggerated hypotheticals, but they fell flat. The audience wasn't buying it anymore. They were too busy hanging on her every word, captivated by her ability to stay composed under pressure. As the third segment drew to a close, she delivered a final blow that left everyone stunned. "At the end of the day," she said, her voice steady and sincere, "this isn't about winning arguments or proving who's smarter. It's about finding real solutions to problems that affect millions of people. If we can't have honest conversations about accountability, then free speech loses its meaning altogether." The room erupted into applause, louder and more sustained than ever before. People stood up cheering while others turned to their neighbors, shaking their heads in disbelief. The seasoned debater sat back in his chair, his smirk replaced by a look of frustration. For the first time in years, he found himself on the defensive and losing. The moderator signaled for a brief pause before moving on to the next round, but the energy in the room was electric. Everyone knew the tide had shifted. The young speaker wasn't just holding her ground. She was dominating the debate. And as the audience buzzed with excitement, one thing was clear. This was far from over. The fourth segment began with the seasoned debater looking more rattled than anyone had ever seen him. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and leaned into the mic again. This time, he tried a different approach. Humor. "All right," he said with a forced chuckle. "I'll admit it. You're good at this. But let's not kid ourselves here. Accountability sounds great in theory, but in practice, it's messy. Who's going to pay for all these independent oversight boards you're talking about? Taxpayers? Big tech? Companies? And how do we know they won't just become another layer of bureaucracy?" His tone was playful, but there was an undercurrent of desperation. The audience laughed politely, but their attention quickly shifted back to the young speaker. She didn't waste any time responding. With a calm smile, she acknowledged his point before dismantling it piece by piece. "You're absolutely right. It's complicated," she said, nodding. "But isn't that true of almost anything worth doing? Look at traffic laws. They cost money to enforce, sure, but we invest in them because they save lives. Why should holding people accountable for spreading harmful misinformation be any different?" Her voice carried conviction, each sentence landing like a well-placed punch. She went on to explain how accountability systems could actually save money in the long run. "Think about it," she said, leaning forward slightly. "How much does it cost to deal with the fallout from false information? Misinformation fuels everything from public health crises to financial scams. Fixing those problems is far more expensive than preventing them in the first place." Her opponent frowned, clearly caught off guard by her practical angle. He tried to pivot, throwing out another sarcastic remark. "So now you're saying we should treat social media posts like traffic tickets? Give someone a fine every time they say something wrong?" The crowd chuckled nervously, unsure whether to take him seriously or not, but she wasn't fazed. Instead, she used his analogy to her advantage. "Not fines," she clarified, her tone patient but firm. "Think of it more like speed checks. We don't punish drivers for going 5 miles over the limit. We warn them. We educate them. And if they keep ignoring the warnings, then yes, there are consequences. It's the same principle here. Flagging false information, providing context, and encouraging critical thinking, that's where we start." Her ability to turn his arguments against him was uncanny. Every jab he threw only seemed to make her stronger. By now, even some of his loyal fans were starting to question whether he had underestimated her. The room buzzed with energy as people whispered among themselves, marveling at her composure and clarity. Desperate to regain control, the seasoned debater switched gears yet again. This time, he decided to focus on what he thought was her weakest point: her lack of experience. "Look," he said, crossing his arms, "you talk a big game about solutions and systems, but have you ever actually implemented anything like this? Have you worked in government? Run a company? Dealt with the real-world challenges of regulating speech?" It was a bold move, and for a moment, the audience seemed uncertain. Would she stumble under the weight of his question? Or would she find a way to sidestep it entirely? To everyone's surprise, she didn't dodge the question. Instead, she embraced it. "No, I haven't implemented these systems myself," she admitted openly, her voice steady. "But neither have you. And that's okay. Just because we haven't personally done something doesn't mean we can't advocate for change. Fresh perspectives matter. If we only listen to people who've been there, done that, we'd never innovate or improve." Her honesty disarmed him. For a split second, he looked genuinely surprised, as though he hadn't expected such a direct response. But he quickly recovered, attempting to mock her again. "So what you're saying is, we should trust your ideas simply because they're new. That's a risky gamble, don't you think?" This time, the audience wasn't having it. A few people shouted back at him, defending her. Others clapped loudly, urging her to continue. Sensing the shift in momentum, she seized the moment. "It's not about trusting my ideas blindly," she said, her voice rising slightly with passion. "It's about being open to new ways of solving old problems. Experience is valuable, yes, but so is imagination. Sometimes the hardest part isn't coming up with solutions, it's having the courage to try them. Her words resonated deeply. People nodded along, captivated by her authenticity. Even her opponent seemed momentarily silenced, his usual arsenal of quips failing to land. For the first time in the debate, he appeared unsure of himself. As the moderator signaled the end of the fourth segment, the room erupted into applause once more. The young speaker stepped back from the mic, her face flushed with excitement but still composed. Meanwhile, the seasoned debater sat back in his chair, visibly frustrated. He glanced at the audience, perhaps realizing for the first time that he might be losing, not just the argument, but also the crowd. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone knew the stakes were higher than ever. With 2 segments left, the outcome was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. The young speaker had proven herself to be a force to be reckoned with. And as the 5th round approached, no one dared look away. The 5th segment started with the seasoned debater looking increasingly desperate. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, adjusted his chair, and leaned into the mic once more. His usual confidence was fading fast, replaced by a mix of irritation and unease. "All right," he said, his tone sharper than before. "Let's talk about something else. You keep saying we need accountability, but what happens when it's abused? When governments or corporations use it as an excuse to silence dissenting voices?" It was a valid point, one that resonated with many in the audience. People sat up straighter, eager to hear how the young speaker would respond. She didn't disappoint. Instead of dodging the question, she leaned into it, her expression thoughtful and composed. "That's a legitimate concern," she admitted, nodding slightly. "Abuse of power is always a risk, no matter what system we're talking about. But avoiding accountability altogether because of that fear is like refusing to drive because cars can crash. The solution isn't to do nothing, it's to build safeguards." Her opponent raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Safeguards? Like what?" he challenged, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A hotline for people to report bad tweets? A committee to decide what's acceptable and what's not? Sounds like a nightmare waiting to happen." She smiled faintly, unfazed by his skepticism. "Actually, yes. Systems like that already exist in other areas of life. Take journalism, for example. News organizations have ethics boards to ensure accuracy and fairness. If someone feels wronged by a story, they can file a complaint. Why shouldn't social media platforms adopt similar measures? It's not about stifling free speech. It's about creating accountability without censorship." Her calm delivery and practical examples made it hard to argue with her. The audience was visibly engaged, nodding along as she spoke. Even some of her opponent's supporters seemed to soften their stance, whispering among themselves about the merits of her ideas. But the seasoned debater wasn't ready to concede just yet. Sensing he was losing ground, he decided to take a darker turn. "You make it sound so simple," he sneered, leaning forward aggressively. "But history shows us that giving anyone, even well-meaning people, the power to regulate speech leads to disaster. Look at authoritarian regimes. They always start with accountability and end with oppression." His words hung heavy in the air, designed to provoke fear and doubt. For a moment, the audience seemed uncertain, glancing at each other nervously. This was the kind of argument he excelled at, playing on emotions, painting worst-case scenarios, to undermine opposing views. But the young speaker didn't flinch. Instead, she met his intensity head-on. "I hear you," she said, her voice steady and sincere. "And I agree. Unchecked power is dangerous. That's why transparency is key. Any system we create has to be open, accountable, and independent. Governments shouldn't control it, and neither should tech giants. It needs to involve ordinary people, experts, and oversight bodies working together." Her response struck a chord. The audience erupted into murmurs of approval, impressed by her ability to address his concerns without backing down. Her opponent, however, looked increasingly flustered. He tried to interrupt her mid-sentence, throwing out another sarcastic remark, but she held up a hand politely, signaling she wasn't finished. "Let me ask you this," she continued, her tone firm but respectful. If we don't hold people accountable for spreading harmful lies, aren't we enabling a different kind of oppression? Families destroyed by scams, communities torn apart by hate speech, aren't those real consequences too? Ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away. It makes it worse. Her words carried weight, cutting through the noise with clarity and compassion. The room fell silent, the audience hanging on every syllable. Even the seasoned debater seemed momentarily stunned, unsure of how to counter her argument. For the first time in the debate, he appeared genuinely rattled. Desperate to regain control, he resorted to personal attacks again. "You're young, idealistic, and full of energy," he said with a dismissive wave. "But ideals don't survive the real world. What happens when your perfect little system fails? Who cleans up the mess then?" This time the audience didn't laugh. Instead, they turned to him with disapproving looks, sensing he was grasping at straws. The young speaker, meanwhile, remained unfazed. With a small, knowing smile, she delivered her final blow. "Ideals are important," she said, her voice strong and steady. "They give us something to strive for. And yes, systems fail sometimes, but doing nothing guarantees failure. At least trying means there's hope. Isn't that worth fighting for?" The room exploded into applause, louder and more sustained than ever before. People stood up, cheering, while others clapped enthusiastically from their seats. Even some of her opponent's supporters joined in, unable to deny the power of her message. As the moderator signaled the end of the fifth segment, it was clear. The tide had turned decisively in her favor. The seasoned debater slumped back in his chair, his smirk gone, replaced by a look of frustration and disbelief. For the first time in years, he found himself outmatched, not by wit or cynicism, but by authenticity and conviction. And as the sixth round approached, everyone knew the debate was far from over. But the young speaker had already claimed the moral high ground. As the sixth segment began, the seasoned debater tried to regroup. He adjusted his tie again, took a deep breath, and leaned into the mic with renewed determination. "All right," he said, his tone firmer now, almost defiant. "Let's talk about something else. You've spent a lot of time talking about accountability and systems, but what about the flip side? What happens when people are too afraid to speak their minds for fear of being called out or labeled problematic?" The audience shifted in their seats, intrigued by this new angle. It was a clever move on his part, shifting the focus from misinformation to the broader implications of accountability. Many nodded along, clearly resonating with the idea of self-censorship. For a moment, it seemed like he might finally regain some traction. But the young speaker didn't falter. She listened carefully as he spoke, letting him finish without interruption. When it was her turn, she leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful but unwavering. "That's a valid concern," she said, nodding slowly. "No one should live in fear of expressing their opinions. But here's the thing. Accountability isn't about silencing people. It's about encouraging responsibility. There's a difference between being cautious because you care about accuracy and staying quiet out of fear." Her opponent raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Oh, really?" he shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Tell that to all the writers, comedians, and thinkers who've been canceled over a single controversial tweet. Accountability sounds great until it becomes a witch hunt." The audience murmured, divided. Some agreed with him, while others waited to hear how she would respond. She didn't hesitate. Instead of getting defensive, she leaned into the complexity of the issue, speaking with both empathy and conviction. "You're absolutely right," she admitted, surprising everyone. "Cancel culture is real and it's a problem. But let's not confuse accountability with mob mentality. Holding someone accountable for spreading harmful falsehoods is not the same as tearing them down over a mistake, or even just a disagreement. The goal isn't punishment, it's learning. If we frame accountability as an opportunity to grow rather than a weapon to destroy, maybe we can find a better balance." Her response struck a chord. People exchanged glances, nodding thoughtfully. Even some of her opponent's supporters seemed impressed by her willingness to acknowledge the flaws in her argument, while still standing firm on her core principles. The seasoned debater, however, wasn't ready to let up. "So what are you saying?" he pressed, his tone sharp. That we should give everyone a free pass if they apologize after causing harm? Where does personal responsibility come into play? She smiled faintly, appreciating the challenge. Personal responsibility is exactly what I'm talking about, she replied, her voice steady. If someone spreads false information or says something hurtful, they need to own up to it. A genuine apology and a commitment to do better can go a long way, but if they double down, deny responsibility, or refuse to learn, then yes, there should be consequences. That's how trust works. Her words carried weight, cutting through the noise with clarity and humanity. The audience erupted into applause, clearly moved by her balanced approach. Her opponent, however, looked increasingly frustrated. He tried to interrupt her again, throwing out another sarcastic remark, but she held up a hand politely, signaling she wasn't finished yet. Look, she continued, her tone softening slightly. I get it. No one likes being criticized. I don't enjoy it either. But criticism isn't always bad. It's how we improve. If we frame accountability as a tool for growth instead of punishment, maybe we can create a culture where people feel safe speaking their minds and responsible for the impact of their words. Her sincerity was impossible to ignore. People clapped loudly, cheering her on as she wrapped up her point. Even her opponent's most loyal fans couldn't help but nod along, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. For the first time in the debate, he appeared genuinely cornered, unsure of how to counter her without sounding unreasonable. Determined to salvage what was left of his argument, he made one last attempt. Fine, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. But how do we ensure that accountability doesn't spiral out of control? Who decides what's acceptable and what's not? She didn't miss a beat. We all do, she said simply, her voice ringing with confidence. It's not about handing power to a single authority figure or group. It's about creating systems that involve diverse perspectives, experts, communities, independent bodies, all working together to keep each other honest. Transparency is key. If people understand how decisions are made, they're less likely to feel targeted unfairly. Her closing statement for the segment drew thunderous applause. The room buzzed with energy, the audience clearly captivated by her vision of a balanced approach to accountability. Meanwhile, the seasoned debater sat back in his chair, visibly deflated. His usual arsenal of quips and jabs had failed him completely, leaving him struggling to regain control. As the moderator signaled the end of the sixth segment, the tension in the room was electric. Everyone knew the final round was coming, and it was shaping up to be a showdown unlike anything anyone had expected. The young speaker had proven herself to be not just a worthy opponent, but a leader with ideas worth listening to. And as the lights dimmed briefly for a commercial break, the crowd erupted into spontaneous cheers, unwilling to contain their admiration any longer. The final segment began, and the energy in the room was electric. The seasoned debater looked weary, his earlier bravado replaced by a mix of frustration and resignation. He glanced at the audience, perhaps sensing that he'd lost much of their support. Still, he wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. Clearing his throat, he leaned into the mic one last time. All right, he said, his tone measured but tinged with sarcasm. Let's wrap this up. You've talked a lot about accountability, transparency, and balance, but isn't all of this just wishful thinking? In the real world, people are messy. They make mistakes. They have biases. How do you plan to enforce these lofty ideals without creating more problems than you solve? It was a strong closing argument, designed to cast doubt on everything she had said so far. For a moment, the audience seemed uncertain, glancing at each other as they processed his words. This was the kind of rhetorical flourish he excelled at, planting seeds of skepticism right before the finish line. But the young speaker didn't flinch. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and stepped up to the mic with quiet determination. You're absolutely right, she began, surprising everyone, including him. People are messy. We all make mistakes. And yes, biases exist everywhere. But that doesn't mean we give up on trying to improve. Progress isn't perfect, it's incremental. Her voice carried both conviction and compassion, drawing the audience back to her side. Think about it, she continued, leaning forward slightly. Every major social change started with an idea that seemed impossible at first. Women's suffrage, civil rights, marriage equality, all of these movements faced resistance because they challenged the status quo. People said they were impractical, unrealistic, or too idealistic. But look where we are today. Change happens when we dare to believe it's possible. Her opponent shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unprepared for this pivot. Instead of engaging directly with his cynicism, she reframed the conversation entirely, shifting from practical systems to the power of hope and collective action. It was a bold move, one that resonated deeply with the audience. Accountability isn't just about rules or oversight, she explained, her tone warm but firm. It's about culture. It's about creating spaces where people feel empowered to speak truthfully, responsibly, and respectfully. Yes, it's hard work. Yes, it takes time. But if we don't try, if we settle for the way things are instead of striving for the way they could be, then nothing will ever change. Her words struck a chord. People nodded along, visibly moved by her message. Even some of her opponent's supporters couldn't help but clap softly, acknowledging the sincerity behind her vision. Sensing she had the room in the palm of her hand, she pressed further. And let's not forget, she added, her voice rising slightly with passion, that accountability works both ways. It's not just about holding others responsible, it's about holding ourselves accountable too. When we admit our mistakes, learn from them, and commit to doing better, we set an example for others to follow. That's how trust is built. That's how communities heal. By now, the seasoned debater looked defeated. His usual arsenal of quips and jabs had failed him completely, leaving him struggling to find a response. He tried to interject once more, throwing out a half-hearted remark about idealism versus realism, but it fell flat. The audience barely reacted, their attention fully focused on the young speaker. As the debate drew to a close, she delivered her final statement, a powerful call to action that left everyone breathless. At the end of the day, she said, her voice steady and sincere, this isn't about winning arguments or proving who's right. It's about finding solutions to problems that affect us all. Free speech is a cornerstone of democracy, but so is responsibility. If we value one over the other, we risk losing both. Let's choose progress over stagnation, empathy over cynicism, and hope over fear. The room erupted into applause, louder and more sustained than ever before. People stood up, cheering wildly, while others clapped enthusiastically from their seats. Some even pulled out their phones to capture the moment, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Meanwhile, the seasoned debater sat back in his chair, visibly deflated. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of disbelief. When the moderator finally stepped in to thank both participants, the contrast between them was stark. While the older debater appeared drained and frustrated, the young speaker radiated confidence and poise. As she walked off stage, surrounded by admirers and journalists eager to interview her, it was clear she had achieved something remarkable. She had dismantled years of cynicism with nothing but logic, authenticity, and heart. Back in Laos, the theater, the audience buzzed with excitement. Conversations erupted everywhere, with people praising her performance and debating the points she had made. Social media lit up almost instantly, with clips of her standout moments going viral within minutes. Hashtags like hope over fear and accountability matters began trending worldwide, cementing her place as a rising star in public discourse. For the seasoned debater, it was a humbling defeat, one that reminded him of the importance of staying grounded and open-minded. And for the young speaker, it was validation that fresh perspectives and honest dialogue could still cut through even the most entrenched cynicism. As the night ended, one thing was certain. The world had witnessed not just a debate, but a turning point. A reminder that meaningful change begins with courage, conviction, and the willingness to imagine a better future.